Okay, welcome everybody. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes as folks come in to just talk about a few top of house things. Um, First things first is that there's a lot of folks from the Center for Open Science here in this webinar. So as you're trickling in, please tell us who you are in the chat. Tell us where you're coming from, maybe what institution you're affiliated with, how long you've been an OSF user. If you do have specific questions in relation to the material from this webinar, which is around licensing on the OSF, please put it in the Q&A so that all of my amazing colleagues can help answer those questions. We have one, two, three, four. There's five of us here that can answer those questions. So please throw them in there. We love the questions. They're very helpful. I won't be able to answer questions while I'm talking. But if you need clarification, please go in there. You will be getting a follow-up email with the recording from this webinar, as well as link to the slides. So if you miss things, don't worry about it. You'll be getting that. And for those of you who are seeing this recording who were not at the webinar, you will also be getting the slides and links. You'll also be getting in a follow-up to this webinar. If you were here, you'll be getting a link to a discount on some of our self-paced training courses, which are amazing, and you can do it at your own pace and have lots of different great features, some of which explain things that we're talking about today, but I'll talk about that a bit later. So this is the second or third, I believe, in our, maybe even fourth, in our series in 2026 of OSF Essentials webinars, where we dive deep into OSF topics each month. And these are in direct response to a lot of questions that we get on our help desk. And the webinars are built around questions, workflows, practical needs you have. I encourage you to sign up for more of these essential webinars that we have on a monthly basis. I'll have some more information at the end of the webinar about how you can find out more and sign up if somehow you ended up here and didn't sign up for the other webinars. So just a couple reminders. Please use the Q&A box for questions. If you want to follow along, I'll be using and referencing our licensing help guide. Introduce yourself in the chat. There's a couple emails here of people that, including myself, who you can email. I'm Nadia Ortelt. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Manager. We also have on this call, hidden under another COS events name, Gretchen Gigan, who you can email about questions about membership for some of our fee-for-service products, but also she's a metadata guru and can answer a lot of those questions. And I'll say that in addition to our help guide, we have a lot of amazing links in there that can help you with questions you might have about specific licenses, how to choose licenses, things like that. And with that, I will jump in. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at what the terms of use actually say about the copyright of data and materials and projects and registrations and preprints that you publish on the OSF. Then we'll cover the licenses you grant to COS and other users when you deposit or publish that content, and how your privacy settings change what those licenses mean practically for reuse. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the licensing choices and obligations you have in licensing material, and how to do that on projects, files, preprints, and registrations. And we'll talk about kind of general approaches to thinking about ownership, privacy, as well as licensing. So there's a kind of ownership question that I want to approach head on, because it's the one that we get a lot of confusion about, and it's whether or not you own your work after you put it on the OSF. You do. Section 6 of our terms of use says it pretty plainly. So if you deposit content onto the OSF, you still own it. Putting data sets, manuscripts, files, or code on the OSF doesn't hand ownership over to the Center for Open Science, COS. We don't become the owner of your research because you are storing it or publishing it or sharing it with us. And we also, very importantly, do not have any editorial input on material posted on the OSF. It's a big point of confusion that I want to also address there, because there is sometimes an assumption that because of the mission of our organization, that somehow we have some kind of editorial control over material posted on the generalist OSF. Obviously, community operated registries and collections and preprint services do have moderation criteria in some cases, and they do have editorial control to a certain extent over the material, but that doesn't impact ownership. Um, and so ownership of the material, again, is yours, even if you are publishing it into moderated services. And so because of that, our terms of use require that you do actually own the material that you're publishing or depositing on the OSF. Also an important thing to keep in mind. If there's a violation of those terms, let's say if you're publishing material that you don't own on the OSF, that's a violation of our terms of use, and we can remove that material. So what you do grant to OSF is a set of really specific limited licenses. So one is so that we can store and display the work, and the other is so that the public who are finding your material, other researchers who are searching for your material, can use the things that you deliberately make public. And those are pretty narrow and defined permissions. It's not a transfer of ownership in any way. So the license that you grant COS is perpetual and irrevocable, and that's something to really keep in mind when you're thinking about public material on the OSF. So if you delete an account or you delete material, it doesn't undo the license for content that you might have shared at some point, because OSF users or readers may have downloaded or shared material that you did make public. So for example, if you made a data set public and somebody downloaded it under a CC BY license, you can't pull that permission back. The copy that they have remains licensed to them. And this connects to some of the features of that we have for withdrawal for registrations and preprints, which you can withdraw, but you can't delete. And metadata does stay behind, including some of that licensing metadata that you may have published with those registrations and preprints. And all of this is intentional. The permanence of that licensing metadata, it's in service of the scholarly record, and the whole point of putting a lot of material that you might license on the OSF publicly and make public is that it can be reused to advance open scholarship frameworks and principles. And this is just, again, top level information to keep in mind when you're thinking about choosing licenses for material that you publish on the OSF. So our terms of use also assign authority to set licensing terms on public material. So an administrator is a person who can identify the ownership of the intellectual property on deposited content, and they can identify and then also modify the license that governs its use. So on a given project or a component or a preprint, it's the administrator who should be setting the license. There's also contributing users, which is a person who can access or edit content, but they shouldn't be setting the license. They can add files and make edits and can change licenses, but that should be a proxy determination that's given to them by an administrator. So again, to think about how this actually applies to how you might license material, if you're on a team like a lab or a multi-institution collaboration, it's worth deciding deliberately, like, who will set the license, who holds those administrator rights, because that's how your collective work will get licensed. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about thinking deliberately about the material that you're putting on the platform, and what you intend and how you intend for others, i.e. the public or people who may find your material, how you intend for it to be used. And all of the licensing is obviously gated by whether or not material on the OSF is private or public. And there's just a couple different delineations. This is elaborated actually in our terms of use and also in many of our help guides around the different objects we have on the OSF. But it's important to think about privacy settings in relation to both ownership and licensing. So we have public versus private, and many of you might be familiar with that in terms of how we currently operate our project workflows on the OSF. So projects can be private and only visible to certain users, contributors, administrators, people with a view-only link, but it can also be made public. Material can be embargoed, and it's in that case it's private until an embargo date passes. And that is useful for registrations, obviously, which can be embargoed for up to 4 years. And then there's we have kind of like limited types of privacy. So this is the case for registrations that have been submitted to a moderated registry and are under review, for example. So that means that like a specific user can view that material for specific periods of time. So again, top level, it's really important to think about the fact that a license is really governing the reuse of content that other people can actually access. And if your data set is private, the reuse license that you might attach to it might not be relevant because nobody can find it. And so the privacy settings on OSF decide who can see it. They're not a license, and the license decides what people can do with the material once they find it. So just keep that in mind. So all of that established, like why bother licensing at all? In some cases, like in our projects, it's not required necessarily to have a license. And that's because the ownership alone doesn't really communicate anything to potential reuser of that material. And so if you think about that from a search perspective, if somebody finds your public data set on the OSF, they want to use it, they want to build on it. What are they allowed to do? If you haven't attached a license, the answer is just governed by our like default copyright, which is all rights reserved. And the implications of that are actually different in different parts of the world. It's murky and it's unhelpful. So an ambiguous reuse position is not a good one to have when you're sharing openly material and data on the OSF. So sharing and just making something public doesn't automatically make your work open for reuse. And so a license can fix that by sending a really clear signal about how somebody may use the material. Can they use it commercially? Do they have to credit you? Can they reuse it with alterations? And your license can answer those questions. So we'll just look at some of the options across the OSF. So a project on the OSF carries a single license that applies to all the material within the project. You can also set no license on a project if you want, because not every project is public, some are private, but you should license your project because it could be public at any time and material could be used from within that project. Files or data files can have their own licenses within the metadata of that file. You can set the license on individual files, even though they're within a project with a specific license. Preprint licenses can be chosen during the submission workflow and do vary depending on what moderated preprint service you're using. And registrations must have a license, which are a part of the metadata of the registration draft creation workflow. And things to think about in terms of licensing obligations. So, you should check to make sure that a decision has not already been made for you. So we review this a bit in our help guides. It's a really important consideration as you prepare to publish material in the OSF. Some funders require or strongly recommend a specific license for any output that they've funded. If that applies to you, the requirement is a priority. And some repositories, not the OSF, do require the use of specific licenses. Some community operated registries or collections or preprint services on the OSF may have requirements. But generalist publication of material in the OSF does not have a requirement you could choose. Many institutions have their own policies also about how research conducted there should be licensed. So that's something you should check in with, again, your library's staff, your VPR's office, your lab, your institution, your funder. And also a final consideration, which I won't delve too much into, but is about jurisdiction. So if you collected or analyzed data in a specific way or place, that can impact what license is required. And so that can sometimes matter for example, international collaborations. Again, really important top level is that COS doesn't choose licenses for you. You do need to choose a license, and the decision is yours, made in consultation with all these different obligations that you might have around your specific research project or collaboration or study that you're conducting. So I'll talk briefly about how to license all of the different kind of objects we call preprints, registrations, and projects on the OSF objects. There are also workflows. There are also things you can publish on the OSF. It's really important to choose the appropriate license to apply to your preprint in order to communicate how you want others to share your work. That said, certain preprint services, like for example, here's an example of a submission workflow on SciArchive, which is a community-operated preprint service on the OSF. They allow for the selection of no license, but they only have 2 licenses available for their preprints. And this is something that you will have to consider when submitting or publishing any kind of preprint on the OSF. This is the part of the metadata of the preprint that you're submitting. And if you search through OSF and look at different preprints, you'll see the licenses displayed alongside other metadata on the right-hand side of the published preprint. There's a couple hand raises. I can see that they're raised, but I can't answer them. So I'll just continue. If you have raised your hand, make sure you throw your question via text into the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar. In terms of licensing your registration, again, license is telling others how they can use your work in the future. It applies to the information, the metadata, and the files submitted with the registration. It's a requirement when creating a draft registration. You can select a license by clicking the drop-down menu to select an option. You can also edit a license during the drafting process of the registration. And to do that, you just select edit in the license field in the metadata, and that allows you to change the license. To apply a license to an OSF project, you can visit a project's overview page, and you can select one from a license picker in the metadata part of the project, component part of the project. You can also select from a variety of commonly used licenses. I'll talk about the categorization of those in a bit. When you open that project, you expand the metadata section in your navigation bar, and you select the license that you want to use. And if you have any questions about licensing a project or any of the objects on the OSF, licensing is a part of the metadata of all of these objects. And so if you go in our help guides, and maybe somebody can drop one of our help guide links, our metadata help guide link, there's a lot of information there about editing and adding metadata to projects. Just a couple of examples of like basic use cases, and these are again coming from our help guides, but if you might want to apply a Creative Commons attribution or CC BY license to a data set so that it can be reused. There are certain licenses for code that allow for example, open source reuse, or you might have some kind of custom license that you might need to use to meet funder or institutional requirements. And those would all be edited here in the metadata of the project. You can also, as I noted, license a specific file. Again, this is within the file metadata that you could choose the license. Metadata can be added to files, again, to help facilitate reuse, to help people identify or search by license to discover material on the OSF. Because files in the OSF are related to projects or registrations that also have their own metadata, you don't have to repeat information on every file, but you can concentrate on the information that might uniquely apply to a file. So if you have a unique license that needs to, for example, be applied to a specific data file or code file, you can add that. So when you open a project, you would open up the file and then edit the file metadata in the same way that you would for a top-level project. So there's 2 families of licenses that the OSF offers. Because the COS and the OSF is not directing you to use specific types of licenses. That is, as I noted at the top, part of the choice that you make in publicly sharing and then delineating the reuse of material on the OSF. I won't go into too much depth, but you can think of the 2 families of licenses, and there are many others, but as Creative Commons and open source licenses. And Creative Commons are often built for data, for text and materials. They're a good fit for preprints, different types of documentation, data sets, study plans. And then there's open source software licenses as well, and those were built for code. There's more permissive licenses like MIT's license, and then there's less permissive. And of course, for projects, and in some cases preprints, there's also the ability to choose no license, and that just leaves default copyright in place. Again, very ambiguous. And in general, we encourage and push you as a user to ensure that you are licensing all the material on the OSF that you do publish and make public so that it can be reused. And I encourage you to check out some of the licensing help guide resources like choosealicense.com and other resources that we have to help you decide what the best license is. Again, alongside with some of the obligations you might have for licensing material. So 3 things again to keep in mind: ownership of material on the OSF, the privacy of the material on the OSF, and the license that you apply. So imagine you deposit a data set on the OSF. You own that data set. You know that you own that data set. You may mark the data set as public. That lets us store the data set, display it. It lets OSF's public users access it. And if you apply a license, like for example CC BY, now there are clear rules that determine and dictate how users may reuse that material. So they may, for example, use it commercially as long as they credit you. And that's the choice that you must make as a OSF user utilizing the platform for registrations, for example, or preprints or files or projects. So a couple of resources again for you. I'll link them here. We'll drop them in the chat. If you have questions about any of this, feel free to reach out. We have OSF support desk, but you can also, if you have really specific questions about a project or about bigger types of questions that may not be available, the answer may not be available in our help guides, you can contact us on our contact page and write out a bit more of the question you may have. So I'm going to pause right now. I'll leave this up here and I'll see if there are any. There's a lot of chats in.
Yeah, I grabbed a couple that
Yeah.
you probably want to answer live, Nadia. One is are there OSF resources or training materials specifically designed for undergraduate researchers?
Yes, you're in luck. There are resources. And if you, in our follow up email to you, we'll be sending through a discount code for our self paced training courses. So we've just launched these on LMS on Canvas. You can take these. There's a fundamentals of open scholarship, which talks about some of the issues we discussed today around licensing and reuse. There's also a course on registrations and registered reports, and we're just about to launch, probably today or tomorrow, a 3rd course on data management and sharing. And these courses provide badges upon completion that you can share on LinkedIn and other places. They're really amazing, and my colleague Crystal Steltenpole has been working really hard to make sure that these are helpful for all types of researchers, including undergrads. So we will look out in your email for the link there, courses.
Awesome. Thanks, Nadia. I did put the link in the chat as well
Great,
for those that are looking for
thanks.
it.
And then,
Oh, go ahead.
oh, no, I was also going to say, I think a lot of the questions that are like specific to maybe a specific research project that you have, like I think there's somebody's published a question or put a question here about like publishing a master's thesis project. A lot of these questions are probably best brought to your library staff at your institution because they can help you. They know specifically how your department might function or how some funders might work or how courses work around publishing material in different types of repositories, of which the OSF is currently one. And they're probably better suited to ask some of those questions.
Yeah, here's another one actually that refers back to one of the previous deep dive sessions. Is a uh, question about registering a scoping review and whether that is best
Mhm.
used as a registration or a preprint.
Yeah, I would say the best thing to do. Actually, I'm probably mispronouncing your name, but Eke Bomo, you should send me an email, Nadia at cos.io. I can send you some resources on scoping reviews and how folks are using our generalized systematic review template on the OSF as a registration for those, and we do have a lot of resources around that. So just shoot me an email if anybody else is interested in that too. Please shoot me an email. But we do have I don't know if any of us can access the link to that webinar at the moment, but we do have a public webinar on scoping reviews from our last essentials. If anyone here can access it, feel free to drop it in the chat. But otherwise, we'll make sure to follow up in the follow up email to everybody here with that as well. And I think to answer your question, who said, I don't, anonymous attendee, common mistakes student make when starting first research projects, I would highly, highly recommend checking out our self-paced course on the fundamentals of open scholarship. A lot of those questions, sort of fundamental, basic, foundational questions about open scholarship practices, how to start, what to do with a study that you might be conducting will be answered in that course. And we also do have a lot of that material, not within a course format, but just the raw material from that training available for free as well. If you go on COS on our Center for Open Science website, we have our training materials linked on our training page. You can find that if somebody wants to drop that link too.
A few more folks in the chat also interested in the scoping review
Okay, so
follow-up.
I think that's great. I'll make sure that in our follow-up to everyone who's attending now and who's registered, that we'll include a link to our previous OSF Essentials webinar, so you can check out the one on scoping reviews as well, systematic and scoping reviews. I think here we have design. Okay, there are more. There's many in the chat here. Okay, was there anything else, Eric or Daniel or Gretchen or Mark, that I've missed here?
Nothing that's open.
Okay,
Um, I think these are all
answered.
answered. Just scrolling through the chat to see if there's anything else there. Um, I don't see anything though.
Okay, if that is it, I think we will close it out. Again, if you have questions, please shoot me an email. You will get a follow up. If you reply to that email, I will be able to see that. It will also be sending links to our previous OSF Essentials webinars on metadata, scoping, and systematic reviews. And we have many more coming up, so please do sign up for those. And thank you all for attending.